Namaste and welcome to Shri Tirumala Devaraya ji. Thank you so much for joining us today with Indica Books, and congratulations on your book In the Empire of the God King. It's
Thank
a fantastic read and a work of fiction. So, and I think the first of the trilogy that you propose to write on the Vijayanagara Empire. So you are the 20th descendant in the line of Krishnadevaraya ji, and what does this legacy mean to you, Tirumala? How since the time you were very young, what is the framework under which you have grown up, and what were the things that were imparted to you that were seen as being very important as part of the legacy?
Right. So that's a great question. So initially, I feel like as growing up, it wasn't imparted in a way, as in things weren't told to me. I was never told to behave a certain manner or act a certain way. It was more so that I just watched the people in my family, how they behaved and what they did. And so my own sort of upbringing was more so just looking at the people around me. And of course, being part of such a legacy, it comes with great privilege as well as responsibility. And of course, I feel very proud to belong to such a dynasty. But at the same time, as I mentioned, there are responsibilities that come with it. But I feel that as I've grown as an individual, I view these responsibilities in a positive way. And they help me sort of guide myself on how to behave as well. But I've seen that also that the way I behave and the way that I look at things, these are things that will also be imparted onto other people. So that is a responsibility that comes with it. So I feel like there are things that I must do and I need to do because I'm part of this lineage that I perhaps wouldn't have felt the need or sort of responsibility to do. Because I feel like just being part of this dynasty and enjoying the privilege, I think that's not the way to go about it. And my grandparents always used to say this certain saying that because you're part of this dynasty, even if you don't do anything good, you should definitely not do anything bad to tarnish their name. But I feel that I need to take it a bit further, and that being part of this dynasty, it means that I have to contribute as well. And I feel that's the responsibility that's on my shoulders.
Mhm. So your father, I think, was living in the US, and so a lot, part of your childhood was spent away from your birthplace. So what are the forces that which are not part of Hampi, which have shaped you to as a writer, and as how you see modernity versus antiquity? And how does one bring about change when circumstances are difficult and society is not really committed to tradition?
Right. So first of all, to address the initial question, yes, when I was a kid, we moved to the US. I think I was about 2 years old. We stayed there for about 6 years. So when I was 8, we moved back. So it wasn't a very long time, but the initial years they were spent there. So these formative years, I think, shaped me in a way that altered my worldview a little. So when I was there initially, I was a bit of a reserved kid, so read a lot of books. Of course, I had a few friends, but most of my time, I think I was reading when I was younger. And in the libraries there, you can borrow, I think, about 15 to 20 books at a time. So we used to bring them home, finish them, return them. And then when we moved back, that's when I first got to know the sort of importance of my lineage because there it wasn't a sort of pivotal part of my life. It wasn't really something that was talked about. Maybe in passing, and as a child, I didn't really understand anything. So when we moved back, that's when I started seeing these things and experiencing them firsthand. And to answer the question about sort of traditions and modernity, and in this society, how people don't sort of value traditions, I think that's a very important thing that we should do. But at the same time, I think modernity in itself as a concept is something that changes quite, it's quite fluid. So I think at some time, even traditions which we long hold to this day, at some time they were also modern. So I think traditions also alter with the age. And I feel like that is something that in our culture, in our society, that we need to sort of keep track of how we don't lose our traditions, but at the same time, don't just stick to something that doesn't allow us to progress as a society. I think where these two things intersect, that's where there's a point which we need to aim for as a society. And I think in the modern world, I think India is the one that's doing it the best. I think sort of combining traditions and modern society. I think in our country we see that quite a lot.
Yeah, absolutely. And for issues facing well-being and health and emotional balance, I think India has the most solutions to offer.
Mhm.
It's just that we don't market these things the way the West does.
We
So
don't,
like
and I
spiritual.
apologies. But another thing that I've noticed is that another sort of negative trait of ours is that we don't realize the importance of what we have until someone else tells us that it's important.
Yeah,
That's
like somebody, I heard a lone voice. We had a function on Saturday event for the network of indie cultural entrepreneurs, people who promote Indian culture through entrepreneurship. And there was one lone voice who said actually Prada did a good thing by getting out these Kolhapuri chappal, because now it's like we'll wake up and start being more protective and also take ownership of our culture.
Mhm.
So we need a wake up call.
On that note, I've
So
seen a few interviews
yeah.
along those lines
Mm.
about how people of Indian origin have tried to do what Prada did, but they weren't successful, which goes to show again.
Yeah, I think this is something that we need to get better at how to brand India, whether it's tourism, whether it's cultural products, whether it's intangible heritage. How do we, and we don't need to shy away from monetizing or making business models out of culture, which many of us are hesitant about, to earn money out of culture and heritage. So maybe that's one thing you can look at when you're abroad. There's one thing about history and how we look at the Vijayanagara Empire. In your research for the book, was it easy for you, because it depends on which lens you're seeing from. If you have someone who is not from looking at it from a Hindu perspective, then their narrative is totally different. The historical sequence of things is very different from how maybe your lineage would look at it. So, as a writer, how do you strike a balance in perspective, or in your mind, is it very clear that did you have a route to research where books or records are maintained by your family? How do you research a book where the history is, the very checkered? And like for instance, even something like language, they say depends on whether you're seeing it from the Kannada perspective of the Hoysalas, or you're seeing it from the Telugu perspective of the Kakatiyas. So how does one decide which lens do we look at history from?
That's actually a very interesting question, and I think most of my life I've kind of dealt with this in a way. Because ever since I was in high school, I've been studying history, and even in university, studied history. So I think the consensus that I've come to is that every source is biased in a way. So to write an objective account of history, we need to take into account all kinds of sources, be it local sources, be it foreign sources, even opposing sources, people who might want to portray you in a negative light. These are all things that need to be studied because even in all kinds of sources, you'll find some kernel or truth of information. And I think the key as a historian is to sort of synthesize all of these and read between the lines as to what actually happened. And of course, my work is historical fiction. So this allowed me a certain leeway, I think, when it comes to historical accounts. Of course, that being said, I've tried to keep everything as true to real history as possible. But again, so looking at the Vijayanagara Empire, there are things which I think even historians who look at contemporary sources, even these historians have their biases. So initially, there's a sort of narrative that has been built when it comes to the Vijayanagara Empire that after the Battle of Talikota, it collapsed, which was not true. I think this was something that was perpetrated by the initial British historians who researched into Vijayanagara because they wanted to sort of create this clash of civilization narrative and show that Vijayanagara was completely annihilated. But while there is truth to that, the fact is that the fact that the empire lingered would not have fit into that narrative that they wanted to portray. So that is something, while this is not covered in my book per se, during my research is something that I found very interesting that even after the Battle of Talikota, 30 years later, Vijayanagara is a very powerful political entity in southern India. So much so that when Akbar was trying to decide whether to march his armies into the south, he sent an envoy to the court of the emperor at that time, who was Venkatapati Raya. He was the grandson of Krishnadevaraya. So during this time, when the envoy came to the court and he proposed to the emperor that actually he should bow down to Akbar, Venkatapati's response was that this is a land that my ancestors have fought and died for. If Akbar wishes to meet me in the field of battle, then we can decide there who will rule these lands. But he said that I will not surrender to any invader, and that after that statement, Akbar never invaded the south. So during that time, you could still consider the Vijayanagara as a very powerful entity at that time.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Your the protagonist in your book, he is, he starts off with not being a very violent or or a soldier in the making. He's from an agricultural family, but then due to the circumstances and the violence that fell upon his family, he becomes martial. So, is that transition easy? You're looking at a period which is so old. You're looking at the 16th century. So, was it something in their blood? Of the warrior aspect of humans. Was that something that was always there in everyone, and down the line it's reduced with with whatever civilization the way it's gone. So, what are your thoughts on the transformation of your main character? Is it possible? The transform. His grandfather, of course, was a very good, I think, swordsman, right? So,
He was a
uh,
soldier.
yeah, yeah. So, one is inheritance from the grandfather, but is such a transition, possible?
I think so. In my main character, he faces a sort of trial by fire. So in his circumstances, this sort of transition goes in a way that he has to change himself to sort of survive in this sort of circumstances that he's been put in. And on that note, I feel that anyone, if not anyone, but most people, if subjected to certain circumstances through their life, they will develop these sort of characteristics and traits. In this term, in this instance, sort of martial valor. Of course, there's an aggressive side I feel to most human beings, but when it comes to becoming a soldier, as I said, he goes through these circumstances. He actually trains for a whole time for his whole time in the court in Bijapur, and all of these things. I think I don't know about everyone, as I mentioned, but most people in these circumstances they would change. And of course, his are particularly harrowing. He has to experience all those things, and I won't give much away without
Hmm.
spoiling anything of the
Yeah.
story. So I feel that yes, of course, in every human there is that sort of seed that can grow, but I don't think that everyone is violent per se, but that. aggressiveness, that martial valor, I think that is present in most human beings. And given a chance to grow, given the right set of circumstances, it will develop.
And you also have circumstances which propel you into greatness,
Mhm.
which kind of almost conspire to make him get his revenge. So is that something that when you're on the right path and when you know there's injustice, when you feel passionately about righting some wrong, have you in your own legacy seen where circumstances and historical events have happened which have aided this kind of a fight?
Yes. So in my main character's circumstances, of course, as a writer, I can engineer things. So as I'm telling the story, it's
Yeah.
easier for you know. But it's not something that I think isn't true. I think it's very much true that in the face of injustice, that one has to stand up. And I feel like initially you might be alone, but then there is a congruence of like-minded people. I refuse to believe that if you stand up for what's right, then that you'll only be facing it alone. I think that in itself is a narrative that's been sort of peddled to people that there is only a warrior against justice. I feel that at heart most people are good, and that there is just a need for someone to take that initial step, and that eventually you will be able to sort of get people behind your banner and fight against what's wrong. When it comes to real world examples, I think for me, I think my grandfather is a good example. So he was part of the Hampi campaign. So this is something that was part of in the integral in the beginning stages. So initially, right before Hampi was declared a UNESCO site, there was a lot of theft or pillaging of idols and stuff around the temples. And to this day, actually, you can find idols from Vijayanagara and Hampi in sort of Sotheby's auctions or Christie's auctions, and they're sold for, I think, hundreds of thousands of pounds. So that greed, I think, sort of propelled people here to steal these idols. So during this time period, my grandfather started this movement along with a few other like-minded individuals, and this, I think, over the years, you can see it's fruitful. That if you visit Hampi to this day, you can see sometimes there are open air museums with idols kept just there in the open air, and people aren't just running off and looting them. And of course, I think this is something, heritage is something that has grown in importance throughout the country, and that some people initially they took the initiative to say that this is our heritage and that we shouldn't steal or loot and sell all of this to whoever it may be. And then initially they may have not been heard. People have been like, oh, we could make so much money from this and all of that. But now as a society, I think we have progressed and we have our own museums, our own heritage. Of course, there are some places which this might not have taken effect just as yet, but I think we are moving towards the right direction. And of course, in history, of course, there are many stories such as this. I think Sri Aurobindo at Pondicherry, I think that's one. So he was imprisoned initially, and then he moved to Pondicherry, and then he became the great saint that he was. And of course, there are many more, but those are the couple that off the top of my head that I can tell you.
Could you tell us about the writing of the book itself? How long did it take for you from the first conceptualization of the idea to rewriting to getting the narrative, then editing and all? What is the time frame and where did you write and what were the influences? What could you talk us through that?
So the initial process, I think, took about 8 months. So I wrote it during my last year of university. So I'd finished a lot of my assignments early, and I found myself with quite a bit of free time. So during this time, I wrote the book per se. The conceptualization, I think it was something that was in my mind for quite a while. I think I always wanted to write a book on Vijayanagara. Initially, I thought I'd write a historical account. That's something that I do want to do later on, but I think that's something I want to do when I think I've honed my craft and I can do it justice. This was historical fiction, so it is still in its essence a story. While it's set in that time period, it popularizes that period. It is a story in that period. So the actual writing process, as I said, took about 8 months, but then rewriting, editing, and just finalizing my drafts and all of that. I think that took another year or so. And then it was a bit of a publishing limbo for a little while. I didn't know if I wanted to go through a traditional publisher or if I wanted to self-publish. So that took a bit of time. In the end, self-publishing was the way we went about it. Self-publishing, as in we opened our own sort of publishing house, and through that, we've released the book. So I think that was how the publishing aspect took it. And researching again, I think in a way it is a combination. So first, I think my whole sort of teenage years, all of it spent during Hampi and all of these historical sites. And what I learned is going about listening to things, sort of the traditional intangible oral storytelling of these lands. And then in university, of course, I did a lot of research into the actual primary, secondary sources of the Vijayanagara Empire. We also had a module which was not focused on Vijayanagara, but which had Vijayanagara as a major part of it in Durham. So that was something which also aided me during my research for the book.
See, a lot of authors in the West who have written about fictionalized either mythology of the West or historical narratives of the West, and who are immensely popular, have mentioned that they're a little hesitant about writing fiction about India because there's a element about our devatas, and there is a spiritual element which they are not familiar enough, because and they don't want to hurt sensibilities.
Mhm.
So is there that element in your book, and how does one navigate that, especially in a place like Hampi, when we are talking about the gods and goddesses being there, and some of them being plundered and destroyed? So how do we deal with that with sensibility, so that we don't hurt the sentiments of your own people, your forefathers? And how do we treat it for international audience who may or may not have that sensibility?
So I think that is a very thin line that can be navigated. I think a few authors have tried to do this. I think Salman Rushdie is one of them. So he wrote a book called The Enchantress of Florence about the Mughal Empire. And then I think his most recent book was called Victory City, which was actually about Vijayanagara. So in both of these things, they're very beautifully written books, but in Victory City in particular, you can tell that the author does not have a personal connection to the place. And I think as native, if you read this book, your sensibilities, I think you have to read it as a work of fiction, is what it is. And if you try to take it into account of actual historical fiction like that, then your sensibilities will be a bit hurt. And I think as someone who is Indian, I think it is easier for me to navigate that route because I know what sensibilities are to be navigated around when it comes to writing in India. And I think just as an Indian, you are more aware because your whole life you navigate around them. And more so in my book, these sort of factors, religion and devatas, and sort of mystical, the magical realism, you could say, they don't play a extremely major role. Of course, they do play a role, as in these are things that my protagonist has grown up with. So he references devatas, he references temples. These are things that has shaped his have shaped his worldview, but at the same time, they don't play an extremely integral part in the story. So they play this sort of role in the world, but not in the story. So when it comes to world building, they are there. You can feel their presence, but in the story, it isn't a major part.
Hmm. So, what, if any, are there any historical actual? There are, the where it is set and the context is all historical. So,
Mm.
what are the elements that are actually aligned with history? And apart from the storyline and the story of the protagonist, what aspects of history you've actually tried to portray?
Right. So the aspect of history, of course, the world building, that is one of them. And I've tried to keep the world as true as to what it would have been like in medieval times at that time period. And a lot of the historical facts are true. For example, in Bijapur, okay, this is a bit hard to navigate around without giving away too many plot details. But the events that happen in Bijapur, for example, the coup or the battle that takes place between the Sultan and the Vijayanagara army at that time, these actually did happen. The death of the Sultan of Bijapur in the battle, that is also something that was historical, and the coup that followed after. Uh, the characters in the court, such as the Sultan, the Sultana, the young Sultan, the Vizier, all of them are based off of historical accounts. Of course, some of them, the accounts are very brief, so it allows me a little leeway to characterize them as I wish. But again, they are real historical figures. And then after that, coming to Vijayanagara, and then going to quell the two rebellions. Again, these are instances which actually happen. And then the rebellion itself, the leader of the rebellion is another historical figure. In this rebellion, in the instance, the leader of this rebellion, his name is Gangaraju. So the real historical figure, he was the leader of Kondavidu, not Kondavidu, sorry, of Umattur, not Bhuvanagiri, as I've mentioned in the book. But I've sort of gelled the two together for the plot details. So there were three rebellions which took place during that time, but I've made two of the rebellions I've sort of gelled into one, while the third one is being dealt with by another army. And of course, the historical figures such as Ramaraya, Krishnadevaraya, Tenali Ramakrishna, all of them are real. And the way they behave and the way they act is something that I've relied on real historical accounts to sort of portray. And then there's a sort of segue in my book where my character he takes he helps Tenali Ramakrishna deal with certain sort of instances in the city, which such as corruption and thievery. So these, I think, were something which I've come up with as myself. The sort of folk tales that I've heard, which I did into my own stories. So these, I think, they're more fictional than historical, but their basis is in sort of real folk stories, which have been passed down to generations. And again, the another major character in my book is, as I mentioned, the world itself. So the cities, I think, play a major part. So these cities are real, as into the fact that how they've been described by foreign travelers, which definitely are the main sources to the description of the cities during that time period.
Yeah. See, in terms of the territory where it extends from, which part of the Deccan it covered, and in terms of structures, in terms of wars and events, we will have some, evidence and context. What about language and dialects and how words were used, how the communication happened? Do we have any evidence of that? For instance, like some of the slangs or swear words seem to be from a very 21st century usage. But when I asked somebody who's much younger, they said it could possibly be a local language where the swear words could be easily translated into the same kind of slang. So how does one get keep the language as being authentic to the times? How do we get as close to the spoken word of the time?
For my book, that is a piece that I chose not to tackle.
Okay.
So when it comes to language, of course, I've used some terms which I explained early on, their English translation, such as father,
Mm,
mother, grandfather, and he's raised in the Kannada side of the Vijayanagara Empire, so those are the words that are being utilized there. But of course, here I've utilized a sort of a narrative that his grandfather, being a soldier who's well traveled, has taught his grandson languages from throughout the empire. So, of course, in the Vijayanagara, it was not just Kannada, it was Kannada, Telugu, Tamil, and some parts Malayalam, and of course, Sanskrit would have also been spoken.
mm,
So, and then when it comes to the north, there is also that element where in the north, in the courts of the sultans, they speak
mm,
these languages. They speak an earlier form of Marathi, and they speak Dakhani, which is the Urdu that is spoken in Hyderabad to this day. So it's a land of many languages, and I feel like in that
mm.
book, if I chose to tackle that, that would have been very
You haven't.
exceptional. So I have
Mm,
used language which is more so, as you mentioned, from the 21st century.
mm,
But at the same time, it's not something which would feel very jarring. So it's not like colloquial slang of the 21st century. It's a formal sort of language.
mm,
Is more modern than what would have been used at that time. And I think that when it comes to certain words, such as names of fruits which were foreign, or sort of ideas, or
mm,
I don't know, sort of ceremonial wear or dresses that come to the court at that time. I've retained their foreign names because even in that time period, because they're newly introduced, they would have been referred to by what the
mm.
people who introduced them to the court would have referred to them as.
Mm. So, how has the response been? Your parents mentioned that in when you went to Hyderabad, there was a good audience. And what is the age group? Like, I met somebody from Coimbatore. He's doing his ME in physics, and he said he had read the book and really enjoyed it. He's a very person, who works in ashrams and is very dharmic. So he was excited to see the book, me reading the book. So who is your audience, and does one have a target audience in when we write such books? Like, would your classmates in Durham or SOAS, would they also be interested in reading a book like this? So do we write with somebody in mind? Do we write for ourselves? And how has the response been?
I think most authors they say that they write their book just for themselves, and that any sort of popularity that you gain by it is just a byproduct. I think this book it's an amalgamation of all three. I had a purpose when I wrote it. I wanted to popularize Vijayanagara history. So the target audience that I had in mind, so I didn't have a particular target audience. I wanted it to be a bit general. That if anyone who wanted to sort of involve themselves in a story in that period, they could read this book and enjoy it. I didn't want to make it too complicated or too childish. I wanted to draw a sort of middle ground, and I think I've managed to achieve that.
Hmm.
And then third, of course, I wrote it for myself in the aspect that this is something which is close to my heart. And so far, the response I think has been pretty good. So far, I think everyone who's finished the book has had positive things to say about it. My classmates in Durham and SOAS, so I haven't gone to SOAS yet, so yet to be seen what they. But my classmates in Durham, they've all asked me to bring a copy with them when I go to London in September.
Hmm.
None of them have read it yet because it's only in sale in India at the moment. But I think I'll be taking a suitcase full of books when I go to London.
Oh, love. Thank you so much, and all the very best in all your ventures. We are looking forward to the next edition, to the second part. And if we would really like to like to track what more you're doing for Hampi and for the Vijayanagara Empire. You've done a lot of other socially relevant work, which we have not actually focused in this interview. But I hope, wish you all the very best with that, Tirumala. And we need young thought leaders like you. And just out of curiosity, could you tell us about the photograph behind you, about the person? Yeah.
This is a painting actually. This is my great grandfather. His name is Darbar Raja Krishnadevaraya. There are a lot of Krishnadevarayas in my family. It's very
Hmm.
cool. So he was the last ruler of Anegundi. So little backstory before that. Anegundi was the kingdom which was established by the successors of the last emperor of Vijayanagara after the fall of the empire. So this is my great grandfather. He was the last ruler of Anegundi before independence.
Yeah, thank you. I'm sure he's looking down and blessing you with all the best. Yeah,
Like,
yeah. Thank you so much for this conversation and looking forward to be in touch with you.
yes, namaste.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.